with Miss Anita's Crafts, and today's craft is going to be a painted craft, but it's also going to be a little bit multimedia, and you'll see what I mean in a little bit, because we're going to do a background and then we're going to kind of make our own stencil and do something cool on top. Looking at here is a 12 by 12 canvas. I just wanted something square, and so I'm going to work with the size that I've got, and I actually paint over old canvases a lot, so that's exactly what I've done here. It's just one of these flat board canvases, not a stretched canvas. And if you do a couple of coats of a color that's not white, usually gray or blue or some sort of a nice background color, you can usually cover over anything that you've got on there from before. So I did a couple of coats of this blue here. I used this tropical blue from Apple Barrel, and in my little palette I've got 3 different colors, so I've got that same blue here because I'm going to do something else now over the top of this plain background. I've also got some regular white paint and a little bit of this really nice blue, which almost looks black in the cup, but it's a really nice blue that looks really good when you mix it with lighter colors. So I like to use this one on the Grumbacher because their phthalo blue looks really, really good. So I'm going to use the same brush that I did for the background. So I didn't wash it yet. I still have all this blue on there. What I'm trying to achieve here is for this to look like a pool background. So it's a nice, like a pool blue, sky blue color background with some wiggly lines over top of it. But you have some shadowy areas and you have some lighter areas where the ripples are showing. So that's what we're going to do with the darker color blue. We're just going to mix the tiniest bit of that into the other blue that we use for the background and sort of do a little bit of shadowy areas all over. So I'll do that second coat. I'm not going to touch the white. I'm going to try to avoid white because I'm going to do something else with that, but if I get a little bit on my brush, that's okay. I'm just going to start to dip in there where I get a little bit of both colors, and I have some of the darker blue on there, and I'm going to just do some patchwork. So just a little bit. You can let it blend. This time you really don't want it to be streaky. You sort of want it to blend, and adjust as you go. So if you want more of that darker blue, just dip a little bit more and load your brush with more of that color. Let it soften, let it blend. So what I'm doing is, without dipping back into the paint, I'm just going back over the wet part that I had already painted over here. And so you kind of want to keep a wet brush, but you don't want it to be too wet. If it's too wet, then it's just kind of getting goopy and gross and it's not blending. But if it's too dry, then it's not going to work to blend. So you want to find a nice balance. So just keep your paint wet, and if you want to use some sort of a blending medium in there just to help make sure that your paint stays wet, that's a good idea too. Those will be clear, so when they dry, it doesn't alter the color of your paint, but it just helps to kind of keep the paint moving, keep it liquid, keep it fluid as you're painting. So I can show you some of those options too. So here's our pool background, and it already looks really good. We've got some shadowy parts, we've got some of the light reflecting from the clouds or whatever you might be looking at if you're looking into a pool. So a good idea is, before you do something like this, you want to keep it wet. Like I said, you want your background to be wet so things can be fluid and moving around, and it helps with blending. A good way to do that is to just do your flat background color, a whole coat of it over the whole thing. And for us, it was this one right here, so our light blue. It would be good to do a coat of that in the background, but to keep it wet, you could use something like a blending medium. And this one's a really thick one, so you can kind of see it in action, because you can see how it really does to help your paint keep moving around without drying on you before you're ready to blend. So you don't want that to happen. You don't want your paint to be dry before you get to blend your other colors into it, and this will help with that. It just sort of slows the drying process. This one is white in the bottle, and it's white when it comes out, and when you mix it into the color that you're going to paint on your background, it will also lighten that color up a little bit, so it might look like a little more of a pastel blue than what you were hoping for. But when it dries clear, so it's just a little bit harder to work with in that sense, because you may be looking at it changing the color of your background a little bit, and you might not trust that it's going to look the right way when it dries, but it really does. It really does dry clear, so you would only see the color of your paint. And the other option that you could use, this one is clear, but it's a lot more of a liquid. It's a lot less thick than the other one that we were just talking about, but it does the same thing. It's another blending medium, blending gel, and this one's by Folk Art. You can't buy this one in the store anymore. I have to buy this online. And it's a little harder to see that this is actually changing your paint, because it will just sort of look like it's watering your paint down a little bit, and this is more liquid than paint would be. It's less of a gel, more of a liquid. So something like this is nice because it doesn't change the color of your paint at all, so you can still see what you're working with and you know what it's going to look like when it dries because it's clear. Okay, so now that that background is done, I'm going to do something a little weird to get the look of the pool water. So I want it to look like ripples, I want it to look like wiggles, and I'm actually just going to use my finger and I'm going to dip into the blue and the white at the same time and just get some on my finger. And while this is still fairly sticky and hasn't totally dried yet, I'm just going to kind of start somewhere and do this. Just some little waves. And I'll do that in different patterns all over. Now, you don't want it to only have the darker parts where you first started, but you do tend to run out of paint as you get about halfway through the motion, so you could start somewhere else on this little wiggly line and put some more paint there so that we've got some differentiation. We have a lighter here, we have a darker there. So now what I'm doing is, since I have all of my lighter blue strokes going through, I'm just taking now mostly white on my finger and just dragging on a little bit of thicker white so it looks like more of a shine. I don't want this everywhere, but I do want it to be in some spots where I want to see a little shine. So I'm just going to kind of put that on a little thick because I want that to look like it's glistening in the sun. Right, now I said this was going to be multimedia, so while we let this dry, we'll put that aside and we'll work on the next part. I want it to look like a shadow or a silhouette of a sea turtle is in the middle of the canvas. So to do that, I want to make my own stencil, and I'm going to use the Cricut, but I'm not going to use Cricut vinyl. When I use the Cricut, I use mostly just sheets of cardstock. And so with this, if it's going to be a stencil, it doesn't matter what color your cardstock is. I just have a 12 by 12 piece of black cardstock, medium cardstock on there. The thicker cardstock is always better if you're going to be using for a stencil, because you want to make sure that it doesn't stick to your canvas or it doesn't get too weak with the wet paint. And so I just have the black one on there because I figure it'll be easy to see when we put it on the blue. Okay, and I have it stuck down. I'm going to go over to my Cricut where I have an image that I've saved of a sea turtle, and I'm going to size it to fit right in the middle of this 12 by 12 canvas, which should be easy to do because that's also the size of this paper. So as long as we have a little bit of a clearance around the edge, maybe an inch or so of a margin around the edge of the turtle, then it won't go over the edge and we know we'll be right there in the middle of the canvas. The little turtle that we cut out, and I did it to the 9-inch mark so that way I knew I had enough space around him so he's not touching the edge anywhere. And because of how he's shaped, I don't know, but it might be kind of cool to put him at a diagonal, so I think I'm going to point his nose that way and his tail that way, going to the top and bottom corners of the canvas. And I cut it to size so I didn't have all the extra pieces on there. That way I could just tape it in place. So I have some painter's tape now that the background is dry. I'm not going to be, you would want to put tape down on a wet, sticky canvas that has not dried yet, because then when you go to peel up the tape, you'll be taking up some paint too. So just put it on 4 corners. Doesn't have to get too technical. Now to fill this in, you wouldn't want to use a regular paintbrush with bristles, because since we've got some space here where if I tap this, you can see it's still slightly elevated. It's not sticky on the back. It's not a sticker since it's just cardstock. So we know that if we were to brush with the paintbrush with bristles, those bristles could get underneath some of these little areas that we don't want to cover. So we want to make sure that stays blue underneath. So we're going to use a little bouncer. This is what they use with stencils. You could use a foam brush too. They sell those at the dollar store, so you don't have to have anything quite like this, but it's nice to have a little flat surface. You could even use a regular sponge, a kitchen sponge. You could just cut it into little squares. They're easier to work with. And then you just dip into your whatever color this is going to be. Now I experimented a little bit by thinking about holding different colors up to it to see what color would look best. And I decided that black or white would look best, and I'm going with black. So the trick is just go straight up and down with this. Don't try to scrub. Don't try to smooth out your paint. Let it be textured and just go right on top. Don't go at a weird angle, because that's when your paint is going to slip underneath. And just tap it enough so that you can see the whole shape is covered in, and then move on. Okay, because the more paint you put on there, the more chance it has to slip underneath those other areas. Just finishing up the last little flipper here. You also want to be really careful around some of the little tiny, tiny parts of the stencil because you don't want to tear those and you don't want it to stick to your spouncer as you're pulling up and maybe rip because it is wet now, so it could tear a little bit easier. And this is something that you don't want to go fast with. You don't just want to go crazy and stamp everywhere. And this is where if you're doing this with kids, you want to make sure that they have a little bit of control over their speed. And even though this is kind of a fun thing to do, they want to make sure they go a little slow over all these extra little tiny pieces because you don't want to break them. All right, so now we can reveal it. You want to be careful lifting this up because obviously if you set it back down, if it slips out of your hands while you're lifting, then you're going to be stamping your canvas with the paint that is on the edges of this little cutout. So hold it up good with one hand while you work the other little corners off with the tape, and then be ready to just pull it away quickly so it has no potential to slip and fall back onto the canvas. And there he is. So this one was a lot of fun because of the colors we got to use. I liked it because it had a lot of steps. It was also really easy and simple to put together, so easy for a kid to do, easy for a beginner to do. Everything we do is for beginners here, so anybody could do this without any skill level. And then using the stencil, of course, makes this a really easy one because that is so recognizable. Even if you are not a good painter and you do not know what a turtle looks like, you could easily stamp that on there, and then it is something that everybody can know right away what it's supposed to be. And I really like the contrast of the color black for the turtle, and then the background is a nice bright blue that we've brightened up even more with the white and different shades in there. So this was a really cool one, and I liked that it had all those different layers to it, so it got a little more hands-on there. That was a lot of fun.